Welcome to the Wounded Angel Network in another episode where we look at healing and therapy and helping wounded angels like ourselves to fly. In this episode I want to talk about that thing we never want to talk about, and that is our own failures. When I was a lot younger, I tried to play golf, and I realized very early on that I was not going to be a good golfer, because every time I hit a bad shot and it went veering off either as a hook or a slice, I would turn away from the bad shot, unable to look at it. A kind of a denial, I suppose. But what it meant was that I never ever followed the ball. And one of the tricks about golf, if it's not going to get very, very expensive, is that even when you hit a bad shot, you have to follow the flight of the ball to see where it goes so that you can go and find it. That shrinking away from failure has stayed with me as a picture of how, in myself and I suppose for many of us, looking at failure is very difficult. It was only in the second half of life, which kind of happens when after 40, I began to realize that although I had reasonable successes in my life, as far as I was concerned, my successes had taught me absolutely nothing. Where I had learnt the most about life and about myself and about how to deal with life was in failing. To the extent that I can honestly say, where I am now, that everything that I know of value I have learnt from failing, and that success has taught me very little. It's not that one doesn't pursue success, but one has to realize that it is in our failures, in following the flight of the hook or the slice, the mistake, the error, the bad judgment, in allowing those failures to exist, we do our best work. Do we like failing? Obviously not. Nobody likes to fail, and nobody sets out to fail. But when failures occur, as they must, it is really helpful if we can embrace those failures and not be embarrassed and shamed by them. Now that's not easy to do, because there are things in my life when, if I was to tell you the events now, I would probably end up blushing with awkwardness and embarrassment about what had happened. I remember one event, I had been in a theatre sports situation where the actors come onto the stage. I was in the audience, a large audience, and the idea was that the audience called out ideas and then the actors took one or two and enacted them. Kind of a whose line is it anyway type scenario. And when people were calling out for ideas, I shouted out something really idealistic and very heavy, because I was a very serious person. And the whole audience, when they heard it, went, "No!" This echo. And I felt crushed, embarrassed at myself for having such a silly, heavy idea in a comedy show, embarrassed by the rejection. And it was years later I happened to refer to this as an awkward moment, blushing in a therapy session. And my therapist said to me, you do know that you're the only person who remembers that event. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized he was correct. Everyone else had moved on immediately from from that moment, they'd rejected my idea. Other ideas had come. The actors had acted. The show had gone on, quite literally. The only person who remembered that moment was me, and it still crushed me every time I remembered it. So why would one do that? I remember watching a talk, a recording, it's available on YouTube, of the Dalai Lama being interviewed. I think it was in Washington or New York Cathedral at a seminar. And somebody from the floor asked a question of His Holiness and said, how do you cope with self-loathing in the Tibetan Buddhist framework? And although the Dalai Lama has very good English skills, he always has somebody with him to translate, usually Thupten Jingma. And he turned to his translator when he heard the question, and he asked the person to repeat it, and he heard it again. What does one do in the Tibetan framework with self-loathing? And he turned to his translator, and you could see he was trying to find a clear understanding of this word, this phrase, self-loathing. And eventually, after lots of discussion with his translator, he turned to the question and he said, who on earth would do that? Who on earth would practice self-loathing? It was a completely foreign concept to the Dalai Lama, just not part of his thought or Tibetan thought or practice at all. So self-loathing is quite a unique, neurotic Western phenomenon. And it comes because we do not allow ourselves to fail. And we don't want to look at failures when they happen. But what if failures were actually incredibly redemptive, healing, restoring? Some of my Christian friends get very angry with me when I suggest to them that the pivotal event that we as Christians celebrate, the crucifixion and the death of Jesus, was actually a terrible, terrible failure. Jesus did not, despite what the fundamentalists will tell you, Jesus did not come to earth to die. That was plan B. Plan A was he came to tell people that they were children of God, that the kingdom of God was within them, and that everybody belonged and everybody was loved of God. But of course, that was rejected out of hand because you've got to make money from it. You can't just let everybody in. You've got to have gates, funnels, conduits, turnstiles. And when that failed, Jesus then allowed himself to become the scapegoat for all that anger and went to his death, still loving, still forgiving. But the crucifixion of Jesus was a failure. Now, if you can get your head around that, then you begin to glimpse the power of that story at a whole new level. That it is through the dying, through the crucifixion, through the allowing of himself to be scapegoated, that Jesus actually begins this whole process of redemption, which at the end of the day says you can't destroy love. John Oliver, the comedian from Last Week Tonight, has a magnificent interview that he does with the Dalai Lama. It's full of flip and it's very witty, and the Dalai Lama engages because has great humor. But in that interview, John Oliver says to him, "You do know that the Chinese hate you." And the Dalai Lama says, "Of course, they've made me a demon." And he does this. And John Oliver says, "How do you cope with that?" He says, "Well, I respond with love. I take all the hatred that they give me and I respond with love." Now that is an integrated whole person. That is somebody who has taken so many significant failures of his country, of his role, of the whole story of Tibet, and integrated it and can still use it to love. So what if our failures, what if the failure of Jesus on the cross, the rejection of the Dalai Lama by the Chinese, the terrible story of Tibet, when integrated into our lives, becomes the very source of our best selves? Again, nobody wants to follow the bad shot, nobody wants to fail deliberately, but when we do, and we acknowledge the failure and integrate the failure, we begin to discover huge new depths of wisdom and of healing. It's almost as if the failure becomes a sacred wound through which we are healed. I'm sure you like myself, have come across people who are unwounded. I call them the unwounded men and women. Usually men, but there are some unwounded women. There's something off about them. There's something too shiny, too righteous, too perfect, too everything. There's just an absence of humanity. And they're actually quite dangerous because they haven't been wounded. They haven't failed significantly enough to become human. Fully human. It's the failures that make us human. And one has to ask why in First Peoples cultures, where I live in the Eastern Cape, in South Africa, there is a group of people, the Amaxhosa, a very old, proud culture. And in the Amaxhosa tradition, young men are taken off to Makweta, just after they leave school, they go to the bush for a period of time and they learn the ways of the elders, the ways of the fathers and mothers. But in that time, they are also, the males, well, it's just the males who do that, but the males are circumcised. Adult circumcision. And it's an incredibly painful wound. But it's a rite of passage. And I know that there are all sorts of discussions around circumcisions, and I don't want to get into that, but in every ancient culture there are traditions of sacred wounding, and they are incredibly healthy. Beware of unwounded people. Now, in our culture, we don't have those rites of passage anymore. They've been lost. They've been sanitized out of our experience. And so we now have to find other ways of woundedness and being wounded. And our failures, personal failures, offer that potential. So often in therapy, people will come to me and they'll begin to tell me about the significant failures of their life. The broken relationships, the failed marriages, the failed academic pursuits, the attempt to be successful in whatever form, and the crash, the fall. Like Icarus, who flies to the sun. You know the story of Icarus, the mythological Greek story of how this young man, his parents make him wings to fly to the gods. They take wax and they put the wax on his arms and they stick feathers in, and so he's got wings. And Icarus flies with his wax wings, and he goes like right into the realm of the gods, but he flies too close. And the wax melts and he comes crashing down. That's the story of becoming human. We think we should fly to the gods, and then we crash, and then we become human. It's in the integration of those Icarus moments. And so when people are telling me these stories about literally all the crap that has happened in their life, the picture I have in my mind is of them collecting a huge pile of dung every failure, every mistake, every ruin is part of this pile of crap, and it's smelly and it stinks. But maybe that is what we have to do in the first half of life. That is a life task. Fail spectacularly in the first half of life so that when you go into the second half of life, you've got a good pile of crap out of which you can begin to make compost. And it's out of that composted crap, mistakes and failures of the first half of our life that we then in the second half can begin to grow roses, because you do know you cannot grow roses without good compost. So failures are not as bad as they might feel when we are failing. When we allow time for them to integrate, for time for them to be made part of us, they become the pathway to wisdom. I'm fascinated in the Jesus story. According to the story that is told of Jesus' death, he dies, he's put in the tomb. On the third day, he returns from the dead. He's resurrected, and he's got a whole new body. He can do things with this body that humans can't normally do. He can pass through walls. He can seemingly be in more than one place at the same time. But one of the interesting accounts, as it is told, is of all the disciples that are gathered together, frightened, hiding away in the upper room, and Jesus appears through the walls, just comes through the locked door, and stands amongst them. And then there's this fascinating account, and he showed them his wounds, the pierced hands, feet, sword in the side. And you have to ask the question, if he had this new resurrected body, why were the wounds still there? I mean, if it's a new reborn body, surely it would be shiny, sparkly, perfect. And yet there are the wounds. Later, in another occasion, he says to Thomas, come and put your finger here. Stick your finger in the wound. Why are the wounds in the glorified, resurrected body of Jesus? Well, it seems that it's when the disciples see the wounds that they recognize that is Jesus. It's through his wounds that he is known as the wounded healer, as the Messiah, as the Lord. Now, I don't know what you make of Christ's story, but you have to admit this is a powerful, powerful image. That it is our woundedness that helps people recognize that we are real. It's not our shininess. It's not our successes and our glitter that makes us real. What makes us real is the fact that we have wounds. And we're not ashamed of them. And we integrate them. Because we are also the fallen angels, like Icarus. We have fallen to the ground. And from there we have stood up and begun again. Healing comes through embracing our failures, our pile of dung, working it, composting it, integrating it into the soil of our lives from which roses can grow. Thank you for your attention, and may the embracing of whatever the failures are in your life help you to come to a place of wholeness and humanity, and may you experience the richness of a fully human life as a wounded angel learning to fly.